to the Visual Storytelling Today show. My name is Shlomi Ron. I'm the co-founder of the Visual Storytelling Institute based here in Miami, Florida. And today we have a fantastic topic to cover. I'm sure everybody's struggling with visual content. On one hand, realizing the importance of the topic, but at the same time, need some help figuring out how to get started. So for this, for today's show, we have a fantastic guest. His name is Payman Tai. He's the founder and president of Visme. It's a great tool. I've been using it myself. It allows you to create engaging presentation and infographics and other forms of visual content. He also the founder of Hindsight Interactive, an award-winning Maryland-based digital agency specializing in website design, user experience, and web app development. So with that, I'd like to welcome Payman to the show. Hi, Payman.
Thank you. How are you, Shlomi? It's been a few weeks since we've talked, but
yeah,
digitally, but nice to see you again.
Exactly. And just for the folks watching or listening to this podcast, I met Payman a couple of months ago where I was looking for a visual content solution for our organization, and definitely found interest in his platform. And since then, he also was kind enough to feature me as a part of the Ask Me Anything program. Great piece about visual storytelling that actually the idea was really nice because the questions were sourced from people from the net. So it was a great success. And again, thanks, Payman, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so absolutely. So as we start with any guest, we would like to kind of get a sense of your backstory. And maybe if you could share with us, how do you get started in general? Forget about Visme, but what is your backstory?
So I was always interested in, animation and design. I think, but I was just never good at it. I suck at drawing. My handwriting is terrible, so I like to type instead of writing. Uh-huh. But my major back in college was in biology.
Wow.
And I was going to be going into sports medicine, and so that's kind of where I was. I was, pretty much into bodybuilding and and that aspect. But by the time, it was time to go to graduate school, I think it was my senior year, I guess I knew by my sophomore year that it's probably not what I want to get into as far as a career goes, but I really didn't know what I wanted to go into. But little by little, the whole internet thing was taking off. At that point, it was 2001 or 2000, actually 1999, 2000. And so to kind of pay myself my way through college, I ended up just starting to design websites, just basically playing with, very, very early versions of HTML programs. Back in the day, you don't need a designer and a developer. Today, there's a person that designs it and a person that codes it. In those days, there was no, back end to websites. So you just kind of designed it and coded it. So that's kind of was a one-man thing. Anyway, so that kind of turned into a little small web design agency, which I called Hindsight Interactive. And to this day, I still run. And it's a small team of about 10 people right now.
A quick question: when you first started with the web design, did you take any classes in design? And
no, I was pretty much self-taught. So I a lot of practice and error. Yeah, I mean, so in design, you just kind of look at things and you learn your way. You look at a lot of examples. It's it's kind of today why I'm into visual communication and so on. But so that's how it started. And then fast forward to around 2009, what ended up was I always have a passion for, things moving, interactivity, and so on. And about a decade ago, you created a lot of things in Flash. That was a program that was by Adobe. And so Adobe bought it. And so a lot of the websites we created were very interactive. And when the iPhone, the first iterations of it came out, they did not support Flash soon after. And therefore, as a result, that was the demise of the program. So that's how Visme kind of came about. It started as an animation tool that was based on HTML5, which is really the fabric of the internet. You can't get rid of it. And, that ended up by the time we launched the beta, it was really for designers to create the Flash content as HTML5. That's something that, you could still view on different devices. But once we did a very soft beta, we soon realized that there's a better potential, and really what we should be doing is to maybe gear this towards the mainstream. And so fast forward today, animation interactivity is a part of Visme, but it is not, it is almost a, sugar is icing on a cake. So it is not the reason people use the application. They use it to create visual content such as presentations and infographics and so on. And then they can also take it to the next level by utilizing the interactive piece of it.
So your core target is really non-designers, basically.
Yeah, it is pretty much. We do have designers that use it, but I would say about 95% are, beginner to intermediate, designers. Well, they're not really designers. So they're beginner, intermediate individuals and professionals, and that have very little to no design experience.
Got it. Right. So that's a very interesting journey, definitely from biology to web design, early days, and then kind of adding some of the HTML5 later technologies to kind of get it into a more timely, more accessible platform for the masses. So
correct.
Fantastic. This is great. And so, as you know, us at VSI, the Visual Storytelling Institute, our mission is really to celebrate visual storytelling and bring it to marketers and content folks that are trying to break through the clutter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of wondering, especially since you are managing both an agency and a visual content / storytelling platform, what is your definition for visual storytelling?
Yeah, so in terms of, I believe, when it comes to visual communication in general, you are basically, telling stories. So we can call it visual storytelling, we can call it visual communication or visual marketing. In essence, you are telling stories. Now, you may be, when people think, or even, I always have a hard time, even to this day, when I think of stories, I'm thinking of a story that, you're saying is nonfiction and so on, but that's not really, or fiction story, it's not necessarily the case. You can tell stories in different things. You can tell stories about products. You can tell stories about, service. You can tell, stories about an organization and about an individual and so on. And so in terms of the marketing and sales aspect of it, it's usually about a product or a service. And then you can detach, other elements to it. So when it comes to visual storytelling, I believe it really is about being able to say it or tell it or show it, I guess is the right word to say, in a digestible manner. So rather than writing a book or rather than having paragraphs and paragraphs of content, you are communicating visually. And so in bits and pieces, easy to digest pieces, you're able to resonate with your audience and get the point across. And that's kind of, I believe, in a nutshell, what at least your focus should be. Because one of the mistakes that non-designers, I believe, make, and again, I do this in my video series and other material that we create at Visme, is to teach and show them that it's very easy to get very detailed and too granular with information.
Right.
But so you have to kind of, you're not writing an essay in terms of communication. So you have to kind of step back and focus on almost the outline. What is the absolute key points, the main statements? So think of the title and the subtitle, the short phrases, the numbers, the stats, the figures. Those are the things that really matter the most. And to emphasize those and to visually represent those elements, because that's what you're kind of really doing. And that could be in a format of might be a simple graphic. It might be an infographic. It might be an interactive video. But at the end of the day, your really main focus is to concentrate on the minimal, the top level information.
Awesome. And I think, I assume probably you also, when you talk about making it brief and in a story format, you're referring to this 3-act story structure, setting conflict and resolution. So there's a nice flow, obviously, to the visual story.
That is exactly right. Yeah. So, in terms of the meat of it, you got to divide it into it's, I was just doing a 3-part series on presentations and also doing
Hmm.
one on infographics, and, the way that you create them, even though the formats are different, the way
Right.
you tell the stories is actually not much different, so you're exactly right. I mean, you have the story itself that you build, the thesis almost, and then you actually
Hmm.
have eventually the climax, and then you have the resolution in that aspect. So, whether you say it in a visual, in a slide format, or whether you say it in a tall infographic, the difference is not that drastic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's exactly what we also tell our clients. Visual storytelling, it's really a story marketing strategy that has three components. One is you got to use the three-act story structure, the
Mhm.
setting, conflict, resolution. Two, which most marketers, for some reason, I'm wondering if you get the same experience, kind of a skip. They, tell the story from their perspective, where they need to tell the story from their customer perspective. So the customer is the hero of the story. It's not about the brand. The
Sure.
brand is just a guide, or helping them along the way. And the last piece is really that you definitely need to communicate your story through some visual formats, images, videos, all the way up to AR and VR.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is, it's got the word visual in it, so it has to be visual, right? It
Yeah.
has to be
Yeah.
representations of things. So,
Yeah.
you say a number,
Hmm.
such as 63%, or you say
Yeah.
63,000.
Yeah.
It's good to actually have it as a figure, but be able to represent that as something. It almost emphasizes it. So, one of the advantages, again, in the visual communication world is that you get to tap into the brain on the individual. I mean, we are visual beings. That's how we were born.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times people talk about this as if visual communication is something new, and it's actually
Hmm.
no. I mean, before there was anything such as language and writing, there was visual communication. I mean,
Yeah.
so petroglyphs were used by cavemen, and then hieroglyphics by Egyptians. I mean, those were formats of writing, but they were actually completely visual. And then now we come in today. It's almost like we're coming back full circle. Where I believe that in some ways humans kind of lost the method of communication, where it went into writing a lot of content and text, which is great, where you
Right.
want to get granular and talk about things. I mean, there is
Yeah.
an absolute purpose about forwarding humanity as far as the amount of
Hmm.
information you have to transfer. But
Right.
at the top level of it is being able to resonate visually. And so there's just study after study, and proving that if you are able to represent things in a visual manner, which is why ads in a visual manner are so much more effective than, let's say, a text ad.
Hmm.
That is, you want to utilize that as a tool in your business, in your marketing, in your branding efforts.
Absolutely. So if we take what you just said in terms of all the fantastic gifts that visual communication provide marketers, both from the native perspective, we born like that. We are much more visual beings, as you said, and also the fact that we see it on the ground. Customers respond better to visual content than text-based. So if we take this to basically the drawing board, where a marketer needs to really come up with a visual content marketing plan, then what would you say the typical business objectives visual content serve? And also, if you can talk a little bit about the point of intersection with the buyer's journey, because those things I think are connected.
Sure. So, are you asking in terms of, for the marketers, how could they utilize visual formats into their marketing?
Yeah, so if you look at like the classic funnel, visual content, is it an awareness play? Is it kind of mid
Sure.
funnel? And how you can support, the stages in the buyer's journey.
Well, I believe in, when you think of marketing, it is more often used at the top of the funnel,
Hmm.
in a very generalized format. Think of a graphical ad, or you think about it on social media, and you have images or graphics and so on that you tap into in your news feed. So you may be able to, it might be a sponsored ad. It
Yep.
might be an ad on TV, but so it actually starts very, very visual, right? Because the first thing
Hmm.
is that when you want to communicate something to an individual, your audience, especially those that are at the top of the funnel, they're, you know, there's a lot of noise, and
Right.
you are just, we are hammered by, you know, hundreds and hundreds of different ads and different visuals all day long.
4.6 billion content pieces according to LinkedIn.
Yeah. So, you know, yeah, exactly. So it, you know, and you think about it at the end of the day, and I think a marketer needs to think of an individual think of your audience. So if I'm going to sleep at the end of the night and I look back to my day and I say, what do I recall today? You know, in terms of what was most interesting to me today, what content do I recall today?
Right.
It often may not be an article where you're thinking of, let's say if it was an article, it may be the visual. I'm actually visualizing pieces of that article versus the text on it, right? So, or the endpoint on it. So you're basically need to, visual communication, when done properly, you can actually do it incorrectly as well. It allows you to eliminate the noise, and so you can actually more easily communicate or get your idea across to your audience. So yes, at the top of the funnel, I think it's key to utilize it, because once you have warmed up that individual into an actual lead or a prospect that has some interest, they've actually clicked through and come to your site, they've clicked through and gone to your article and so on. You know, they're a little bit more open to taking a few more seconds actually reading and being served additional information. So I think it is actually more at the top of the funnel than at the very, very bottom of it.
Right.
Now, in the mid funnel, I think let's just think of it as I'm trying to gear
consideration, basically.
Yeah, consideration. So if I'm trying to bring more, you know, traffic to a blog, let's say a market and you know, they are doing content marketing and they were writing content, they're doing visuals externally, such as an infographic, and they want people to click and come to their site and so on.
Right.
So when you come to the website, it almost starts over again. You have a new message or you're reaffirming something. But being able to, at that point, being able to tap into visuals, combine it with content. So if it's a blog post, you might have a 52,000 word blog post. Your cover image is key, because that is what's going to speak, you know, to the individual or reaffirm the title of that article. And then, you know, you have a few paragraphs and you have a visual, a few paragraphs, a visual, a couple of paragraphs, and you have a visual that actually, you know, is resonating within that content. So it's a supporting mechanism in essence. So what you can do is, instead of having a very, very long piece of article or ebook and so on, being able to tap into, maybe it's photos, maybe it's GIFs, maybe it's actual visuals that you're creating, maybe it's chart, you know, that really helps to improve the engagement that the user has. I can't recall if there was a study or not on that. At least I don't remember the info on it, but if you have a very tall article, what are the chances of an individual, A, remembering it, and two, finishing it in terms of percentage wise, versus one that has supplemented, you know, effective visuals in between it? You very likely are going to get better engagement with the one that's a combination of both. So I wouldn't be saying this in terms of that an individual needs to replace, you know, visual with text, and there's absolutely a purpose of it. I think it's more of a matter of using it as a supplementation when it merits.
Yeah, so it sounds like, you know, the bulk of, you know, the impact of visual content is definitely happening at the top of the funnel to support awareness objectives. And here you can throw in the videos, the infographics, some e-cards if you're doing these things. And as you go down the funnel, now you're kind of entering the territory of long form communication. Could be a blog post, but then you can actually support it with still with visual, just to make it more interesting and more engaging, so it's not dry.
That's correct.
And after, I would argue also, to kind of continue your line of thought, you know, after you close the deal, maybe that's the point. Obviously, you can celebrate, obviously, that you have a new customer, so it's kind of the onboarding experience could also be supported with visuals. And later on, you know, once they are a happy customer, you can actually use a visual strategy to turn them into advocates. So basically some cooler, you know, visual materials. I don't know if it's videos or maybe featuring them, the customers, maybe the testimonials, video testimonials become an interesting tool to celebrate, you know, what we call happy customers.
That's absolutely correct. And we actually will be a little bit guilty of it if we haven't tapped into that enough at the very bottom of the funnel.
Yeah.
We use it a lot for the top or the middle, but that is absolutely correct. And I guess in addition, you know, in terms of you know, there are definite use cases for you know, at the towards the bottom of it as well, in terms of when you actually have generated a lead. And for example, I think academic wise, you know, when you're dealing with a lot of stats and information, you know, even if you grab that, then you have, let's say, an ebook and you have a literature material, the way that you're presenting information, if it's a lot of data, big data, or large amount of stats and so on, you know, they're very highly correlated visuals such as infographics or heavy graphs. I think they have a great place in academics, you know, because you can take this tremendous amount of information that would otherwise be a, you know, multi-page, let's say, document, and actually translate that into a visual. So that's something I think that serves pretty well, you know, on the academic side.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, from this perspective, you know, if you need to kind of dumb it down to simplify the argument, I think it's probably very similar to a video game experience where people, as they progress in their levels, they get some visual gratification, celebrating their success and moving to the next level. And, you know, in the buyer's journey, I mean, you're doing the same thing. Obviously, we're not saying here that you need to gratify them with the same visual message every time.
Exactly right. I mean, it brings up another example. So at our agency, it's one of my colleagues had that idea, and it's kind of been neat. It's just a, you know, just for fun, but I think it's been actually pretty kind of a nice gesture. So each time that we finish developing a site for a client, when the site goes live, and you know, to kind of add to the excitement, there is a graphic that we send them in an email. You know, congratulations, your site has launched. It's actually like a rocket as an illustration that is taken off representing their website. So it's been kind of a neat thing. So it's an afterthought in that aspect, which, you know, is supported by the visual versus actually saying, hey, great, your site's launched.
And I'm a great believer in those little things, because customers pay attention to those things. I can give you like a short story. You know, I went to an Italian restaurant here in Miami and with my wife for dinner. And one night, you know, the waiter just set us down in a table, and then he brought this little low stool. I didn't realize what it was, what's the purpose for this. And he said, oh, this is just for your wife to put her bag on. I mean, come on. I mean, those little things, and the fact that I'm telling this story, it just gives you a sense of why, you know, it stuck with me. So I'm sure, you know, if you create those visual gratification, I call them, you know, a couple of years ago, there was a great wave for random acts of kindness.
Yes.
And I wrote a blog post a couple of years ago about how you need to transform this into a routine act of kindness. So it's really part of your buyer's journey experience, like you do exactly. You know, whenever you have a client just completed a web project, you've celebrated in even a small way. It goes a long way.
That's exactly right. So yeah, you know, adding to your point, that's I agree with that. You know, it's almost a matter of questioning, and not a matter of forcing it, but always asking the question is that, would a visual improve the engagement in this this level or this step? It might be a funnel, it might be a process, it might be something else. So I believe that that's you know, an add-on. So yes.
Absolutely. Great. So now that we got a sense of a little bit of what is visual storytelling, a little bit about, you know, some of the business objectives, the funnel, you know, one of the challenges marketers always, you know, are actually grappling with is how they can actually create a visual content that are really authentic, that people can, you know, believe it, because, you know, there's so much out there. So how can you get through authenticity?
I think the authenticity comes out of the individual, you know, telling their story that is authentic in itself. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
guess copying what everybody else is doing is not
Yeah.
authentic.
Yeah.
Believe me, you can get a lot of ideas by looking at what others are doing, and you know, learn from it, or you work on improving it. But for example, case in point, you know, stock photography.
Mm-hmm.
You know, let's say you're going to create a graph that's going to represent a success or a achievement,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in business
Yeah.
or in relationship. So, you know, and often in stock photos, you get a handshake. I mean, that handshake,
Yeah.
you know, has been used so many times. Or you have a, you know, group of people in a business setting, and they're always smiling, you know, and it's not always smiling. You know, that's kind of a little bit cliche in a sense. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, the norm doesn't always work. So it's okay to kind of step out of the boundaries, but
Mm.
it needs to be a reflection of what you're trying to say. Obviously,
Right.
you know, the messaging has to be appropriate. Two, it should be extremely simple and clean. You know, I
Mm.
think when we talk about visual communication, it's okay to have text, but it should be minimal. You know, just getting off the topic for just a moment, if you look at Facebook, you know,
Mm-hmm.
covers or Facebook posts, when you actually go to sponsor a graphic, if you're going to sponsor a graphic on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
if you have too much text, and I believe it's 25-30% or so off of my head,
Right.
they will not actually approve that graphic. They will decline it,
Mm-hmm.
because the point is it's supposed to be visual communication.
Right.
So that kind of goes back to the saying of, you know, less is more.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the process of creating the visuals, it's great to tap into examples and other what others are doing. But at the end of the day, you got to step back and decide, what is the point of this item? What is the point of this design? And work your way around that versus thinking what you need to translate to the user, but step on the other side. What is it that I want them to understand, to speak their language?
So speaking about the process you just mentioned, do you have kind of a sort of like a workflow or like steps that you go through typically when you're looking to create a story, visual story?
Sure. So it starts with an outline. I mean,
Uh-huh.
you know, before you even design anything, you got to know what your story is. So let's say you've established that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, create an outline, almost a brainstorming as far as, because look, here's the thing: the first outline or the first title or subject that you come up with is probably not the one. So you usually got to brainstorm around it. It's just like, you know, it's no different than,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, writing a book or writing a blog post. You come up with a few different ideas. You use the process of elimination to eliminate that. And then from there, once you have that, then you fill between the lines. And from there is where you actually move on to the design process, to the actual creation process. Now, you know, non-designers, I think the problem is that they're trying to do, they may not have a understanding of contrast and
Yeah.
coordination.
Colors. Yeah.
So those are key.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, you want to first, you know, begin have a very basic understanding of what are some of the complementary colors. It's actually not very difficult once you understand the principles of it. You know, I did a video about the
Mm-hmm.
color wheel and how you can actually use complementary colors, and then from there use an accent color. You basically stick to 2, if not 3 colors maximum. Often you actually select one color and
Mm-hmm.
you just go monotone. You use different shades or tints of that color, and then you may have an accent color. The accent may be the call to action, you know. So
Yeah.
if I'm doing a graphic for a banner ad on a site, and there might be an image in the background. I want to make sure, and there might be a text. I need to make sure the text has enough contrast against the background. So the white text over dark background will work, you know, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
A blue text over red is not going to work. It's not going to be, you know, or yellow over another. So they don't, you know, they're not complementary colors. And then you have a focal point. Your focal point is where you want the user to mostly focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that might be after reading the message. It's the call to action,
Right.
you know, button or click here or learn more.
Uh-huh.
You make that pop more. You make it subtle and yet large enough that the user has seen another object, and then the color needs to be almost accent. So that is the one object that stands out. So let's say you have a white text over a darker background, or when I say white, it might be light text, you know,
Mm-hmm.
lighter. And then you have orange, let's say an orange button to the bottom right of it. and it says learn more or click here. So you are not going to miss that button. And also it wasn't the first thing you probably looked at because your focal point may have been the text and the image behind it. So, you know, the process of the design, it does take practice. You do not have to, you know, think of, I need to spend weeks and months to learn how to create elements. A lot of times you start from templates that are already created. It could be our tool Visme, it could be in Canva, it could be in many other tools out there. So that's the beauty of it, is that design is getting you know, democratized. So you can pretty much create something neat in minimal amount of time. Just understand the very, very basic principles, and you'll be just fine after that.
So just to summarize, so basically the first step, obviously knowing your audience is number one, setting your business objectives. But once you know those two things, it's about time to create the outline that kind of spell out your story, what you're going to tell them. And then you want to figure out your design strategy, how you're actually going to execute this. And we kind of, on purpose, kind of describing very generic process that most likely could apply to any visual format, right?
It does. And I guess just backing up a little bit, you're right. You know, the principles of colors and as far as contrast, I mean, they apply to any design. It could be anything from a video down to just a graphic for social media. They're no different, really, in the majority of cases. But yeah, I mean, once you have the outline and then you have the design, you know, in between that, you know, you want to also establish the focus and the medium. So who is your audience? What am I creating this for? Is this sales oriented? Is this for, you know, educational purposes? What is the purpose of it? Also the type of content that you're creating. So is the content where I'm comparing something to something else? That's going to be more of a comparison type. So if it was you know, it's great to use infographics for visualizing these kind of things, or like if it's a process or a timeline comparison, because what you can do is you can create this very simple flow, top to bottom, comparing apples to pears, you know, apples on the left, pears on the right, and you go through a checklist or visual, you know, element. So you actually want to establish, based on the what you're trying to communicate, what is the format, the structure that I think. Additionally, what is the medium that I want to create on? So the medium being, you know, obviously if I'm going to be presenting in front of an audience, or if I'm going to be creating graphic that is going to be posted on my site, or is going to be not conversational in essence, where a presentation, you know, you actually ask questions, you get feedback and answers. So there's a certain level of engagement. But in the other end, though, will be as if it's going to be self-served, you know, it's going to be put online and people are just meant to view that. You know, there's a little bit of a difference as far as the way that you may present and put that material together. And also, I mean, again, if you're, you know, the graphic or the visual that you're going to create, what type of platform is it for? Is it going to be digital? Am I going to be printing it? Is it supposed to be a slideshow, as a pitch deck, a presentation? So these different things, you know, it kind of can veer the way that you go about it, but from a very high level, the principles of it are not much different. You start with an outline and then you work your way through the type and then actual design.
And I would kind of extend your line of thought here in terms of, you know, setting. It's really, there's two main factors that kind of help you create your process. As you mentioned, the purpose, and we talked about, you know, the different, it could be top of the funnel, mid of the funnel, or even it could be like advocacy, celebrating a happy customer experience. Obviously, that's a factor in your planning. Number two, you mentioned the platform experience. So obviously, your visual content is going to be different if you, as you said, going to insert it in presentation format versus Instagram versus LinkedIn. So every platform has its own culture, and you got to respect that. So you kind of have those two factors that kind of at play here.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you know absolutely. I mean, if you're, you know, on LinkedIn, it's going to be very business oriented, and Instagram is more of a fun related. Although it's, you know, you can do ads and different graphics for business, but it has a little bit of a different non-academic, you know, feel to it almost. So, you know, you share your personal stories on Instagram. You share your, you know, business experiences on, you know, LinkedIn. Facebook can be kind of in between, but it's still more towards Instagram. You know, it's more of it's a social network in that aspect. But yeah, I mean, the audience you're going to be presenting to really veers as far as how you're going to put that content together. So for example, if it's going to be very specifically for academic purposes, you can be a little bit more probably content oriented. You could get away with having a little bit more text and high graphs and so on.
Yep.
But if you're going to be, let's say, presenting to an audience that has a very short memory in that aspect, and they're just on a rush, so you're going to be utilizing a marketer, for example. If you're going to be presenting to a marketer at the top of the funnel, it's going to be to the point, quick, and pretty catchy.
Absolutely.
So there's a difference in that aspect. If I'm going to be presenting in front of an educational audience, the presentation, the way I put it together, is going to be a little bit different than if I was going to be doing it, let's say, for a different criteria or enterprise type of audience.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the audience is really key to. It's actually like cooking a dish. You got the core ingredients is your audience. Their stage in the buying cycle, and really in what pot, which is the platform experience, you're actually going to cook it.
Exactly.
So it makes a lot of difference.
You're right.
Great. So now that we understand a bit about the process, can you give us kind of illustrative examples of visual content that you think can really underscore those principles we just discussed?
Sure, I can do that. Do you want me to share screen, or we can just add that later on?
Yeah, we can add it later on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be probably better. In terms of examples, I think one of the things will be is this video series I did recently about the infographics. It was episode 1 of the, actually I think it's episode 7, but part 1 of how to create compelling infographics, where I showed what makes a good infographic.
Right.
There's a bunch of different examples where I showed where what is positive, what is negative. I showed some good examples and I showed some negative ones, but that same principle can be applied to the presentation. I believe the ones that they tell a story and there's a little bit of a fun factor to them, that's a positive. I believe if the color scheme appeals to the actual story itself or the topic itself, that's a biggie. And that, if there's a human factor to it, I believe that actually speaks volumes usually as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean photos of individuals, but it could be representations of individuals, and so being able to bring the human factor into the visuals, that really is an effective, means to do that. So you can kind of, the viewer can kind of see themselves in that aspect and be able to view that. So I believe that's another, example. We did a infographic on.
And just a quick note about that.
Sure,
I think,
sure.
I think the example you just gave is another factor that maybe our audience could leverage, which is education. Once you teach people something of value, the visual content is really cutting through like butter, because you're not selling them anything, you're selling them knowledge. And I think that's an important factor. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And yeah, we did an infographic just recently. One of our designers did it, and it's called "What is Paralanguage?" and how you can use it to give better presentations. So that actually has a little bit of has some nice stats and figures, but also it has this human factor on a few different characters. So that's a pretty good example that you could just kind of correlate with as an individual, as a viewer.
Cool. Yeah, good stuff. Yeah. So now that we got a sense for the some examples as well, at the end of the day, marketers constantly execute programs, and they need to basically report to their leadership on results, right?
Yes.
So, as in you're guessing where I'm going with that. So, so how do you measure success? What are the KPIs for visual content that we know that we actually making progress, and we can communicate it to, our peers, to our leadership, and so on?
In terms of how to measure it, is that your question?
Yeah.
So there is this kind of, I believe, bottleneck in
Mm-hmm.
terms of knowing, and many studies shown that it works, but there
Mm-hmm.
is this challenge of being able to very clearly measure it
Mm-hmm.
all the time. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. It's a little bit difficult to measure certain visuals. So in when you create, let's say, an infographic, or and if you, let's say, even a presentation and it's on SlideShare, often people don't have links on
Mm-hmm.
that visual, or in an infographic towards the very bottom, typically they're images. And
Right.
so, when it says, created by such and such organization, uh,
Mm-hmm.
that is getting credit for the data and so on, often that is not a link. So you can really, in essence, click on it and then be able to, through analytics, measure, how many people clicked over and came from there. They have to actually go to Google and type it in, or there has to be a separate link within the content of
Right.
the article, especially when the infographics get shared over and over again. Then from there, you really can measure the rundown of the many different sites that may pick it up, but you'll
Mm-hmm.
never see traffic from it directly. It might just be, turned into organic.
Unless it's
Um,
it sits on a Bitly or something, right?
Yes, yeah. So that's right. Unless you actually go through that
Mm-hmm.
aspect and actually tap into that, but often people don't do that, or they don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of loss of results in that aspect. So it may show in other
Mm-hmm.
metrics, but it won't show directly as being correlated with the visual itself. Or it's difficult to have, if you have an article as a whole that has visuals representations on it, it's very difficult for you to measure if the individuals were actually engaging directly with that image. I mean, there's different heat maps and so on. You can measure some things, but most people don't.
Yeah.
And so you can't directly measure that. You can, experience and say, hey, articles that contain X amount of images, or
Yeah. Kind of A/B testing. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you can A/B test it. But in terms
Yeah.
of knowing that specific article,
Mm-hmm.
you're not A/B testing it, you can't really tell. So there
Right.
is that kind of a bottleneck, asset. But adding to the fact of, when you have results, if you have results generated from whatever marketing, from whatever other
Mm-hmm.
avenues, being able to actually share that information and that results in
Mm-hmm.
a visual format versus some boring looking table that you look
Right.
at, and it's hard to be able to see trends and so on. Being able to see those trends and be able to highlight those stats to
Mm.
your executives, to your company, to your organization, is key.
Yeah.
So that, again, going back to even completely outside of funnel, it comes back to being able to tap into visuals to actually improve the engagement that the individual has, or your audience has, to it.
Yeah. And I think also it probably has to do with the platform you actually communicate it on. So obviously on Instagram, you can measure that. On
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, there's tons of insights, but the key thing to remember is really, and I think that's what you're referring to, is really to set those KPIs based on each, if it's a awareness KPI versus consideration versus, advocacy. So you can set them up, and this way get a sense of how my program is doing in general, because obviously you have a lot of kind of what we call weeds level
Sure.
metrics, how many views on Instagram. It could be the same image that you actually put on Facebook,
Yeah.
but each one reports differently. So obviously this is kind of the weeds level. So it's important to come up with a kind of a upper level KPIs that can give you a good sense of the first view of the business objective you set up to do. So yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely, you're right. So I think that part has some catching up to do in terms of, and as more data comes and as people are able to measure that more, then the trend will continue to increase in terms of, towards the visual communication part. But I think there is another holdup, is that most people, majority of us are visual communicators, but we're not visual creators, right?
Right.
So that's where do-it-yourself tools like ours and many others are come to light, because to help to solve that challenge. But at the same time, I mean, look, I think that's a trend where I think looking back in 5 years, you will have a tremendous amount of additional visual content being created, but at some point, a lot of that becomes noise too. I think it's starting to already look like noise. So you have to have something that, it stands out or it's unique. And again, I believe that comes back to the story, the visuals that tell the better stories or have that kind of humor or that sense of, emotional connection. They're the ones that are going to stand out over, the noise. So that, I believe, is where it goes. I mean, there's often, you think about National Geographic, there's been images that in 20, 30 years are still remembered. I still remember the photo. I think this beautiful girl's eyes, I think she has a green eyes from Afghanistan. I think she was from like 20.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
So, you think about like, when I think of when somebody says, National Geographic,
Like
that
timeless
photo,
pieces, yeah.
yeah, that and one of an elephant and so on. Those are ones that come to my mind, even though I've seen thousands and millions of images. So that that emotional, that kind of uniqueness from it, and most people won't get it right. But even if you do a better job, if you utilize it, it will work for you versus against you, and then you can kind of work on improving that within your own kind of parameters.
So it's you pretty much touched on my next question, the future of visual storytelling. That if I heard you correctly, it sounds like, if you can, they kind of summarize it in one sentence, is that regardless of the technology of the day, the story always wins, in essence.
I believe it does. I mean, I believe so. One of the things that I actually just did, you're right, because to add to that, it's not about being able to do more and more and more. Yes, certainly there's, a lot of studies of it, an effective video, which takes a lot more time to put together effort than just a static image.
Right.
They actually have higher engagement than that. It still comes down to the story at the end of the day. But at the end, though, I don't think it's so much about where, the more interactive technology or what you create gets, the better the engagement's going to be. I think, that also can become noise. You can actually lose individual with too much interactivity. Example, I think there's a lot of, movies that are created, sci-fi and so on. And, even to this day, maybe I'm getting too old. I watch and there's way too much action. When I look back and say, you know what, I like that movie, even though it was my favorite sci-fi, it had less, 3D and so on it. And therefore, so you can overdo it easily. That's my point.
Yeah, you lose the narrative, basically.
You do, and I think that's a mistake that we actually had made in my agency, where whole thing about Flash. When Flash went away, we used to create Flash sites, and all the sites have a lot of. They had intros, there was music, there was audio, there was a lot of movement, objects moving around.
Yeah,
people will look at it like, that's great, that's cool, that's neat. Looking back though, when that went away, it eliminated a lot of the noise, because it was getting to a point where everybody's trying to outdo, every site was trying to outdo each other, because the competitor had a Flash intro that they wanted to have a Flash intro that was interactive. So you kind of lighting those things down. Now it came back again to the messaging. So now you visit most websites, you look at the homepage, there might be some motion going around, but it's back to the story, the message, the visual element. So there's been actually a lot of cleanup.
Yeah, so it's a maturity aspect, I guess, of the market. Yes. Absolutely.
Correct. So that, I think, going back, it's not about, again, less is more is always going to win in terms of visual communication.
Awesome. So I'd like to kind of close, maybe if you can give us a kind of, top 3 tips that marketers and content folks could take away.
Sure. Number one, you got to know who you're creating for. You have to have a deep understanding of your audience. And if you don't get that down, if you don't establish that at the very beginning, you're going to lose the messaging. So then bring your story together and say it in a manner that's going to appeal to your audience. So that's the end result. And 3, turn the tables around and be the audience. Put yourself in their perspective and say, what could you have said? What could the product say to me? What could the service say to me? What could I read on this or get from this visual that would allow me to engage better, that would actually convince me? So, from those angles, I think you have a much better success rate than being the seller. So in other words, don't be the seller. And I'm not using the word marketer, because, marketing, you're actually communicating or improving. But when you're a salesperson or a sales individual, you are forcing someone almost to take something. So don't force someone to do it, but just kind of speak their language and connect with them emotionally. And of course, it all starts with this story.
No, this is fantastic. No, thank you so much, Paiman. This was a wonderful information and great value, I'm sure, for our audience. And how can people reach out to you? How they can contact you?
Sure. So they can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in my first name and last name and connect with me if you're interested. And also, as far as Twitter, it's at Payman Tai. So you can connect to me that way. And of course, on our site, Visme as well, you can always send a little support ticket and just say, hey, I want to reach Payman, and they'll direct it to me.
Awesome. Good stuff. All right. So thank you again for wonderful information. And just want to remind our audience that this show is recorded both on video. We're going to have it on our website, the interactive video, also syndicated on YouTube. And the great thing about this show, it's also going to be formatted as an audio podcast. So you can actually subscribe to it on iTunes, look for Visual Storytelling Today, and you can catch up on this show and other shows as well. So until next time, I wish everybody a great day and keep your story going strong. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paiman.
Thank you.